love it. I love it, and I'm without further ado, let's bring Godfrey Cheshire out and give him a golden thumb. You're going to get standing on.
Who's going to bring that?
Nate.
Nate's going to bring that.
And we are going to have a little discussion. It's going to be another one of our firsts at this festival. Our first Skype guest. A surprise guest who couldn't travel for physical reasons, but he's going to be with us today. But we're going to wait and tell you who it is. I'm going to bring Matt Zolerseis out, and I've asked him to moderate this panel for two reasons. One reason is because he and Godfrey actually work very closely together doing film reviewing at
New York Press.
New York Press. But the other reason is because I realized when I saw this movie again today and when I saw it before, I get very emotional when I watch this. And this is just the type of movie that we talk about when you talk about bringing people together and talking about issues and doing something that can change somebody's heart. Because watching it today, I realized one of the reasons I really wanted this movie here, because of the subject matter and because Roger reviewed it and all that, it actually helped me do some healing in my heart around race in a way that I didn't even know was even necessary. So we'll talk about that a little bit, but thank you so much, Godfrey.
Thank you, Chaz. I'm so honored to be here and at your reaction and at what you just said, because I said to you that the best compliment I ever got on this movie, I think, was from an old black man who said it's a healing film. And if that is the case, and that was certainly part of the intent, it's really the greatest thing anyone could say to me, and you're the second person that said that, so okay. Thank you very much. I'll also say Southerners and film critics alike are very anniversary conscious, and not only is this the 100th anniversary of Birth of a Nation, but this week is the 150th anniversary of the end of the Civil War. A week ago today was General Lee's surrender at Appomattox. On Sunday is the anniversary of when the Yankees swept into Midway. Monday is the day when they conquered Raleigh and the slaves went back and stole the portrait of our great-great-great-grandmother. And yesterday was the anniversary of the death of President Lincoln after being shot by John Wilkes Booth. So this is pretty amazing. Just that week in American history is extraordinary in terms of what it represents to, the whole story of the country, I think.
And I am on the board of the Abraham Lincoln Library Foundation. And this year, we are celebrating the 150th anniversary of the 13th Amendment. And a recreation of the carriage for the death of Abraham Lincoln was just took place in Springfield. I was supposed to be in Springfield, but I told them I am actually every year our board meeting is during Ebertfest, so I've only been able to attend it once. But this year, we give something called the Lincoln Leadership Prize, and we're giving it May 18th. And at my suggestion, we're giving it the Lincoln Leadership Prize to the Little Rock Nine this year. One of them died, and there are 8 left, and we're flying all 8 in to Chicago for May 18th. And so I'm very sort of imbued in history, and this is really all part of it.
So, Godfrey, I remember, Chaz had alluded to this, Godfrey and I go way back, and this is, Another anniversary, by no means as important as the other ones Godfrey mentioned, is 20 years ago this year, Godfrey hired me to join him as a critic at New York Press. So Godfrey's been a mentor to me, and of course Roger was as well, and to be here on stage with Chaz and Godfrey is just an extraordinary moment, though not as extraordinary as I'm sure it is for Godfrey, because what a response to this movie. What a response to this movie. And Roger said something in his review. As often, he has this ability to cut right to it. When a critic decides to make a movie, it does help tremendously, I think, if they make something that is a subject of urgent personal interest to them. And that's certainly the case with you. And I remember years before you made this movie, you telling me stories about your family. And we were just talking about this earlier today as well. Godfrey, I'm from Texas. Okay, so that's a former slaveholding state as well. And Godfrey and I, as fellow former Confederate state residents living in New York City, had many discussions about the images of the South that appeared in American movies. And Godfrey always would seek out movies that portrayed the South in a non-stereotypical way or in a surprising way, and particularly portraits of white Southerners where the defining element wasn't always race and racism. And remember, but they were often movies where that was a factor, like movies like the Robert Duvall film The Apostle was one that Godfrey championed in New York City. I mean, he was beating the drum for The Apostle big time. Like there was no bigger ally for Robert Duvall and The Apostle than Godfrey. And Sling Blade.
That's one of the ones we're talking about inviting next year to the festival.
That's a great one. I hope you do, because it's an extraordinary film. But a lot of movies along those lines. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how the history of the South on film intersects with your own history and maybe how it shaped your perception of yourself. Because when I watch this movie, this is the third time I've seen it, and only the first time I've seen it with an audience, I get the sense of you trying to understand yourself by making this movie. In a way, it's almost like, I don't know what the budget of this film was, but this is like, in addition to being a movie, isn't it also kind of therapy?
Well, I don't know. I have had, it's a way of getting out there a lot of things that I've been thinking about most of my life. Because I was, as I sort of say in the film, the movie theater became the fascinating place of mystery and stories that the plantation had been when I was a little kid. And so those two things have always been linked in my mind. But as soon as I was sort of old enough to start thinking about what I was seeing in movies, I started thinking about how every movie I saw about the South was really interesting in various ways and reflected aspects of Southern culture, but was in some ways the point of view of an outsider. Even Gone with the Wind, that's David O. Selznick's point of view on that material that was not native to him. And so I really thought about this a lot, and it's funny because the first year I started as a critic, I saw my first film by Ross McElwee, who, any of you all know Sherman's March and other Ross McElwee's films. It sounds like you don't, but he's a North Carolinian who I think Sherman's March is a masterpiece. It came out in the early 80s, but he was a North Carolinian who he teaches at Harvard, and he's been in.
He makes first-person documentaries.
He makes first-person documentaries.
They're very much like diaries, almost.
Yeah, and he comes back to the South in Sherman's March, and basically he's supposed to be making a film about General Sherman's march through the South, but he realized he identifies with General Sherman, and he uses the occasion to just revisit a bunch of old girlfriends. And it's about him trying to deal with his romantic
His
past.
girlfand breaks up with him while he's making the movie.
Well,
right? He's like, his Sherman's March becomes his march to figure out why he can't hold a relationship together.
Yeah. It's very, very funny. But it is, when I first started seeing his films, I realized these are the first films that I've really seen from, by a Southerner, from a Southern point of view. And it was something that I kept thinking about from then on, and then seeing things that I thought represented the South in a more genuine way, like The Apostle, like Sling Blade, were the things I was always seeking out. And I was always on guard and pushing back against those things that seemed to falsify the Southern experience and Southern culture as I knew it.
You said something in your narration here that really jumped out at me, and I wondered if you could elaborate on it. This idea that the South lost the Civil War but won the peace, and that the way they won the peace was by putting forth these images of the plantation and of the South that mythologized it.
Right.
And the connection that you draw between the mythology of the West and the mythology of the former Confederate South is very interesting, because you say that the two most popular sort of worlds for early movies to inhabit were the Wild West
Right.
and the American South.
Right.
And they're both mythologized, and it's like that's our Greek mythology or something almost.
Well, in that era, and this had a lot to do with the boom of the popular press in the North and the growth of just northern populations, urban populations. You had these penny dreadful newspapers, and they were all trading in, the most entertaining stuff that they could come up with. And this was true not only of newspapers, magazines, and different kinds of things that were published, but also things that were on stage. And when the movies came along, starting in the beginning of the 20th century, they were just cranking things out, and they were looking for stories. And the stories that people responded to most were either stories about the West or stories about the South. And I mentioned just briefly here the idea that the urban populations that were consuming this were living in a very high pressure, and in a lot of ways not always very pleasant industrial situation, and they needed kind of imaginary escapes. And the South and the West were the big ones. And it's hard for us to imagine now how big those things were in popular culture. Later, Westerns were a big thing in movies. Some movies about the South were big. But in that time between like the 1880s and the 1920s, these things were huge. Like there were so many of them. And American culture's first big international export were minstrel shows. And minstrel shows were a mythologized musical version of Southern plantation life. But indeed, the plantation myth was very resurgent after the Civil War and was embraced as popular entertainment, whereas there wasn't a lot of popularity for the sort of the counter myth, except for Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was not only the best-selling novel of the century, but also the most successful American stage production of any type ever. It ran for 75 years in all sorts of variations. This is something that we don't know yet, but that myth, although except for that one form, didn't have much traction compared to the various expressions of the Southern myth, the Moonlight and Magnolias literature and plays and theater, and the minstrel show's musical version of all that.
And one of the things that I wanted to make sure that your movie didn't do, and I could see you in there struggling to be fair, to tell both sides of the story,
Right.
and not to romanticize the things about the history and the house. And I was so glad when your cousin also joined in the things that he talked about. And I realized that until I saw your movie, I always had a strong dislike for even the word plantation. To me, plantation just meant slavery and people being whipped and the unfairness of it. And it was only after I first watched your movie that I was able to even relax. When I saw the shops, Midway Plantation, in the movie, and it took some of the sting of the word away
Right.
from me. I was actually down in South Carolina this weekend, and I was going through some areas where someone told me, these were some slave-owning areas. I went through Savannah, Georgia, and sort of just seeing how I felt about things before knowing that we were going to have your movie on this weekend. And I went through it with a new eye after thinking about showing the two parts of your family coming together in that movie. And like I said, the sting, because I was the head of the Black Student Union.
Yeah.
I did a lot of marching. I did a lot of things for fighting for civil rights. And my cousins who were Southern, when I would go to the South, this is what I couldn't reconcile.
Mm-hmm.
I always felt such an affinity with Southerners because of their hospitality.
Yeah.
And my cousins, the Southerners that I knew, my cousins they were always so welcoming and so warm. And then I was thinking, and even white Southerners that I knew, the same thing. But then I said, how do you reconcile this part of somebody's personality with this part of history? And so this was very good for me.
Right. one thing about all of this is the sort of the thinking about this and the emotions attached to it has never stopped evolving. And I really think, I don't know that I could have made this movie 25 years ago, because the plantation is a very, very polarizing, historically, very polarizing image. And that's one thing I realized I was going to have to deal with if I was going to make a film about my family's plantation, is why is it so polarizing? And to try to, in a way, depolarize it. But part of that is because the black people in the last generation have started to try to understand their own family history, and in some ways have sort of returned to the plantation with the idea that this is now something that they want to include in their history, and not in an entirely negative way, because, you know, so much of African American culture comes out of plantation culture. And this was, you know, when I originally set out to make this movie, my idea for the third act, you know, the first act is setting it all up, second act is moving the place. Third act was going to be the relationship, the new relationship that Americans, and especially African Americans, have with the plantation as an image. And that was going to deal a lot with how a lot of American music, so much of American music comes out of that culture. Cooking, storytelling, all sorts of things that we all value now, and African Americans value too, even though the history is kind of painful, very painful in some ways, that there are a lot of very positive aspects that can be focused on as well. And a lot of African Americans, as a result of roots, that's how that factors in, want to know their own family histories, don't want to just turn away. As Robert Hinton and I talked a lot about how the generation of his parents sort of wanted to look away from the plantation, didn't want to look back because it was a painful memory, whereas a couple of generations down the road, there's an interest in looking back and sort of reclaiming that. And I like the idea of African Americans reclaiming this. This is not, the property may belong to white people, but the history and the culture belongs to everyone.
And I just want to say one thing, because this is really important. I want to compliment you on something that you did in this movie, because you could have edited it out. I forget which one of your cousins was sitting around saying how their family was so nice to their slaves and to, you know, the black people that they knew, and he used the word niggers. And he said the niggers we slept with them, we did, it just like, and the first time I was like, what?
Right.
What? Did he say that?
Yeah.
Is he not aware? And you could have edited that out, and you let it go and just let it.
I thought it was important to be in there because, you know, it's in a section where I have my present day family talking about slavery and all of that, and it shows you how people think about this and deal with it, that are connected to it in this way. I think all of my family, my white family, are very uncomfortable talking about this and thinking about it, but they process it by saying, well, we were kind to our slaves. We're the kindest people. My cousin,
everybody whose family was ever involved in that says that.
right, but my cousin Possum, the last thing in the world I would want to be on this earth is his slave. Not the kindest guy you've ever met, I promise you. And my cousin Winky, his brother, who uses the N-word, he does it deliberately. He's deliberately provocative in that way, but I think it was valuable because people, Southerners, white Southerners, especially when they're just talking to other whites, still use that word. I mean, nobody in my social circle, Cousin Winky lives way down east in a sort of a backwater, but people in that circumstance do talk that way still, and I think it's important to register. And, you know, one of the great things that Robert Hinton and I observed, we had a screening of the film at what was his high school growing up, and during it was very mixed race situation, and after that scene, a white woman got up and was storming out of the thing, and a black woman stopped her and said, "No, you need to listen to this," because it makes white people a lot more uncomfortable than it makes black people. Black people go, "Yep, I know," you know.
I think this would actually be an excellent opportunity to introduce our special guest, which is a former professor of African American Studies at NYU, Dr. Robert Hinton.
This has got, yes.
There you go.
Robert. can you hear us?
Oh, yes, I can hear you.
And I'm told that you can see us as well. Is that true?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. And you're on a big, giant screen. Thank you so much.
This is
That's
weird, Robert.
appropriate.
You're kind of like a big face on Mount Rushmore, and we're your little pebbles at your feet.
Yeah, it's a good thing I shaved for this.
Yeah, exactly.
Could you hear any of the conversation we were having before you came on?
Yes, I heard it all.
Okay.
Do you want to jump in on any of the stuff we were just talking about?
No, I'm enjoying your conversation.
Okay, I could have let you tell that story about the black woman stopping the white woman who wanted to stomp out after.
well, actually, I had forgotten about that, but now I'm glad you reminded me.
You may have been the one that observed that, actually.
I'm not sure how it happened, but actually, you were talking about Winky, and I always felt like I would have liked to see more of Winky in the film, and I can understand why you didn't want more of him there, but
Actually, you know, the factor in the editing of people, some people wanted to see more of Winky and Possum because we have a lot of very, very colorful interview material with them. But the reason that was not more is that they didn't come to the reopening of the plantation. And if they had been there in the latter phases of the story, it would have made sense for us to have more of them earlier. But when we had more of them earlier and they weren't in the last part, people said, well, why aren't they there? And we cut it down to the point where nobody says that now. So,
And why weren't they there at the reopening?
you know, Charlie really didn't want them there because he thought that they might be disruptive. But
Oh.
I did want them there. They might have been disruptive. I mean, it's hard to say. But I'm sort of sorry they didn't show up and sort of not sorry they didn't show up.
I wanted everybody there. There would have been 1,000 people there if everybody Godfrey invited had shown up.
Well, you know, I wanted a very big crowd there, but this is something about shooting that last scene. We had to have that last scene. I, as the filmmaker, had to have that last scene. We had assembled the film, you know, everything up until that, and we knew that we had to shoot something. We had an edited film except for the last scene, and I said to Charlie and Dina, we've got to shoot this last scene. They had just moved back. They said, what are you talking about? We got to shoot another scene. You're kidding. And I said, no, we got to have a last scene. So they set up that party in just a few days, and I was very grateful to them that they allowed me to do it and to have people come out there and stage it because they had just moved into the house like 6 days before, and it was all brand new, and it was really an imposition, but I said, we're trying to make Sundance, so come on, you know.
You know, it was so emotional for me when I saw Abraham walk into that house, and for him to even say, do you mean I can go inside?
That's right. That's like a very key moment that
Yeah.
Abraham says, because when he grew up, black people never went in the front door. I mean, he never saw that, but he moved to New York in the 30s, is that right, Robert?
It was about 1930.
In the Depression, I believe. So he left North Carolina long before black people ever went in front doors of big houses like that.
And how did it feel for you the first time walking into the house, Robert?
It was a little strange. I actually considered going in the back door myself, just because I didn't have to. I thought it would be a little melodramatic, so I decided just to go in the front door like a normal person.
You know, I told Godfrey that when I first saw you walk onto the screen, the first time I saw the movie, and I looked at you, and I looked at Godfrey, and I thought that you two actually resembled each other. You both had that handsome, square-jawed look, and that I knew immediately when you came on that you must have been a relative.
Robert,
Godfrey has this fantasy that we're related, but if we are, I don't want to know. So,
Robert, this is Matt. I wanted to ask you about something. In rewatching this film, I was really focusing very much on you as a presence in the film. And of course, you know, who you are in a film is not necessarily who you are when the film is being shot. But I wondered, can you talk a little bit about your sort of demeanor in the film early on? It seems like it changes. It seems like you're a very skeptical presence early on. And as the story progresses, you seem to become a little more invested and perhaps surprised at how invested you're becoming. Yeah. Am I right about that? Or can you talk about that, how it feels?
Well, the whole thing, the whole process. I say early in the film that the whole thing is kind of unreal, and I guess the more involved I got, well, I was involved on two levels. I was involved on the level of making the film and trying to have a successful film and trying to help Godfrey make the best film possible. But on another level, I got more involved emotionally with just the history of the situation. And the night we spent in the house there was very important to me because if you remember the image of the house, the wing that pokes out on the right side, that was not, and it was just very strange to sleep in that room and realize that 100 years earlier, that my great grandmother probably cleaned that room, and that if there are ghosts, they were probably in that space time. So it was complicated. I'm still dealing with it.
Where did
I
Matt
think
go?
I think that there's some. I think we're having just a little bit of. I noticed that
Audio
the
trouble?
syncopation
Yeah, we're getting a
is
little
just a little
audio
bit
trouble.
off sync.
Yeah.
And sometimes that happens with Skype. But
Right.
Is that what you went back to tell them? Okay. I was the first time I visited the Thomas Jefferson House.
Monticello.
Monticello, and I visited a few times. The first time I visited, they really didn't have anything. They didn't really say much about the slaves. They never mentioned Sally Hemings' name, anything. And so I registered a complaint, and I said, if you're going to say that this is a historic site, you have to do it accurately. You have to have some accuracy, or you have to acknowledge the slaves who built this, and where are they? Where are the plantation houses? Where did they live? Where are they buried? A few years later, I went back, and I know some other people also had the same concerns, and now they do. Now it is part of.
Yeah, it's changed a lot in a lot of places. I'm probably not everywhere in the South. South is kind of slow to change in some of those ways, but I think that there's a lot of sort of consciousness of this now, so that the narratives that are presented at these plantations that are open to the public are changing. Robert, do you have anything to say about that?
Well, a friend of mine, Peter Wood, who teaches or at least taught it, who tells a story. I don't know if it's a true story, but it's a good story. He said he was on a tour of Monticello, and he heard a woman say, "This is such a nice house. I wonder if he had any hair."
I wonder if he had any what?
I can believe that very readily. If it's not true, it should be.
Don't stand
Yeah.
too close.
Oh, we were talking earlier about relationship. It's possible that my wife is actually related to Godfrey in a roundabout way, because she's related to the Tuckers of Virginia, and so all of that crowd in North Carolina, Virginia, are related to each other. So she's probably Godfrey's 17th cousin somewhere.
Okay.
Well, you're right that all those, so many of those families in North Carolina were related to each other. The plantation-owning families, they all intermarried very much. I remember driving to the beach when I was a little kid, and my mother would point at houses, and she'd say, "You're kin to that plantation." It was just a funny image to me if I was kin to that house over there, but she meant, of course, I was kin to the family that lived there.
Well, Robert, thank you so much. We are going to conclude our Skype portion and go back to the stage. But is there anything else that you would like to say, or you would like for us to know, or any questions, anything you want to tell the audience here?
Robert, why don't you talk about what you're working on now and what you're looking forward to doing?
Well, actually, right now I'm putting the finishing touches on an article that is an expansion. Well, when we started this project of the film, I wrote what I call a historical memorandum for Godfrey, laying out what history I could figure out in a very short time, because time was tight. So since then, I have expanded that research, and I'm about to, very soon I'm going to submit an article for publication in which I go into a great deal of other stuff that is an extension of what you have seen in the film. Most of what I have found will not make Godfrey happy.
Oh.
Oh.
So,
but it makes me very curious. I can't wait to read it. Is it
Well-
still going to be called Mingo Creek?
yeah, it's called history. It's called Memory and History on Mingo Creek. And among the things I have found out is that your cousin Henry Mordecai, that he essentially ran a brothel with light-skinned girls for white men.
Wow.
And then also I found evidence that the Mordecais and your cousin Betsy Hinton from Clay Hill on the Neuse, that they all sold slaves into the domestic slave trade, sold people down the river to Alabama.
Ooh.
So, you know, it's
Sorry about that.
It's the kind of stuff you want me to do, but you won't be happy when you read it.
Yeah.
You know, I noticed a subtle change. In the beginning, you both were talking about our cousins, our relatives. Now, all of a sudden, they are your relatives.
Yeah, Robert. Come on, man.
My relatives didn't have any slaves to sell. So.
Okay. Fair enough.
Your white relatives may have. But, you know, I was in Raleigh. I just came from Raleigh. I was in there the last week, and I was talking earlier about the end of the Civil War there, and there's a display in the City of Raleigh Museum about the end of the Civil War, and Henry Mordecai gets a very bad thing. They'd say he was known for being a cruel master, and when the Union soldiers found out about him, they went over there to string him up over to the Mordecai house, and he had flown the coop, is what the thing says on the. And I'd heard that he was a cruel master as well.
There, in the 1930s, I think it was 1937, when the Federal Writers Project interviewed former slaves, there are two of them who talk about Henry. And they talk about him, one of them says he enjoyed making slaves suffer, and he apparently had a serious drinking problem. Now, some of this goes back to the fact that when he was younger, Henry suffered from juvenile arthritis, and he was probably constantly in pain, and he was self-medicating. So, I mean, that's not an excuse, but it may be a partial explanation. But he was a very unhappy person, and he projected his unhappiness on other people.
Right. Well, this display was very interesting. I don't know if you know this story about the one Confederate who was killed in Raleigh when the Yankees came in. He was a Texan, young Texan, and he was the only one that fired on the Yankees when they came into town. And my mother, shows you how people have different stories that they tell. My mother has passed down the story that I'm sure she'd known from very young, that he was this romantic guy who was just this wonderful guy, and when they captured him, they told him they were going to string him up, and he said, well, I'm just newly married, let me write a letter to his wife, and they wouldn't do it. And so this is an example of how cruel the Yankees were. Well, the thing in the City of Raleigh Museum, it quotes a contemporary account that may have been from a slave later, who said that they grabbed this guy after he shot into the crowd, and they brought him to the Union commander and said, why did you do that? And he goes, because you're a bunch of Yankees, and I want to see you all dead in a pile. And they said, well, you're crazy, this means we're gonna hang you. And he just started laughing like crazy and said, go ahead, I dare you. And the Union commander said to take him out of the sight of the women and to string him up. And they said he laughed like crazy until his neck broke.
You did say he was from Texas, right?
He was from, yeah, exactly. From Texas, right?
Oh, from Texas.
So, anyway, Robert, I really miss you, and I want to come see you soon. I hope you're doing well.
Okay, you're invited.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Oh, yeah,
Yeah, please.
Okay. Well, that was really, really great. So we're going to open the floor for a few questions. We can't do too many because we got another show coming up. But if anybody wants to ask anything of Godfrey, wait for a microphone. Here we go. Wayne, there we go, down in front there.
I think we have Nell Minow has a question.
Oh,
okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This is one of my absolute favorite movies. It was a thrill to see it in the theater.
Thank you.
In reading over the credits, I noticed that there's a Hinton performing the music, and I wanted to ask you about that.
Good question.
Good question. Chaz and I were talking about that. Her name is Algie May Hinton, and she's a kind of a famous practitioner of these blues. She's really a wonderful performer. We've actually done a shows at the Museum of History with her performing after the film. Her husband, her late husband, is kin to some of the Hinton plantations. We don't know how. But this kind of music, talking about how so much of American popular culture can be traced back to the plantation in music especially, is the form of the blues called Piedmont blues. And it came out of these plantation cultures of North Carolina and South Carolina. It's very specific to that region.
You know, I forgot, there's one other thing I wanted to congratulate you on in this movie. We started talking about the race of it, but racial politics, to see a movie where you show how something is done. I love the person who was in charge of moving that house. I would love to have him on any construction project that I did.
I called him the John Wayne of our movie. I thought he was fantastic.
It's so rare that you get to see in a movie how something is actually done. I've heard about houses being picked up and moved, and you really don't know. So I have to congratulate you on that.
Well, thanks. And the whole thing turned out to be a lot more fascinating and complicated and weird than I thought. I mean, moving it across that rock quarry, wow. You know, it was kind of spectacular as well. What's that?
What about that white dress shirt that he had on the whole time?
Mike Blake had on?
Yeah, he did. At some point he did.
I don't know. He's performing. That's all I can think. He knows he's in a movie.
Question from the balcony.
Balcony.
In the middle, in the center right here.
Well, thank you very much for that film. I really, really enjoyed the technical aspect and what that involved, and all the human relationships around the move. But one thing I missed was the financial aspect of it, and what that entailed, and how people were able to do that, and was there a sacrifice? What about the time involved, taken from the job, all that? All those resource aspects, I kind of missed.
How much does it cost to move a house?
Well, let me start with this. The biggest sacrifice made financially out of this whole thing was me. I can testify that if you want to put yourself in a poorhouse, make a documentary film independently. But anyway, the whole thing, Charlie, Midway Plantation was sitting on 100 acres, and he sold 30-some for a very large amount of money. But the guy that bought it and put the shopping center there, he paid for the whole move of the house. But something I left out of this was that that developer, and Charlie and Dina had a big falling out before the plantation was moved, and they were at each other's throats. I had some good stuff of Charlie talking in a very angry way, but it didn't seem essential to the story. But the developer said, if you don't have the house off of the property by the date that we agreed on, June 30th, I'm going to bulldoze everything. And he was really, really serious about that. And the problem was that Charlie was going to move it across certain land to get to where you saw it go, but there was a little sliver of land that they had to go across that the man who owned it died, and he had 9 children, and we had to Charlie had to have lawyers chase down all 9. And that's why he moved them off of the buildings off of the property and put them on what we call the holding area or whatever, where I said they looked like they were a stage set, and then we go into the Gone with the Wind thing. They sat there for a good while they chased down the man's descendants, and so it was a much more complicated process than the film ends up showing. But the financial part of it, basically, Charlie, he and I did Q&As after the film came out. He would never answer any questions about money. I mean, he just does not talk about the money. But I can tell you what I know is that that land was very, very valuable. I think they made enough money to pay for the restoration of the house, which they had to pay for, and the new property. But the developer did pay for the move itself.
Oh, we got one more question out front.
In real life, how harrowing was it on the day the house was going past that quarry and over the bridge? Because as a film buff, I just started thinking about Fitzcarraldo.
Yeah. Others have said that, and something about that I didn't know until I was doing a Q&A with Mike Blake, the mover, is he said when he was there on the radio when the thing was about to go across the bridge, he was talking to the two guys who designed the bridge and found out that it was their first project after coming out of college because he had doubts that the bridge was actually going to hold the weight. And it was like, I'm really glad I didn't know that when that was happening. Boy, am I glad I didn't know that.
Well, thank you very much, folks, for coming to this
Thanks, everyone.
fine film.
Really appreciate it.
All right.
I'm so glad.